The evening sky turned dark and stormy, and the villagers could feel the tension in the air. They hurried indoors, rushing to escape the cold rain that began to pour in torrents. On the outskirts of the village the storm was even more unforgiving. Rain seeped into the small homes there, rising in pools on their floors and leaving families with little choice but to seek shelter elsewhere. The nearest haven was a modest cottage perched on the edge of the village, the home of Grumpy Gordan. Grumpy Gordan was not exactly known for his hospitality. He kept to himself, muttering about the weather, the noise, and his neighbours. The first knock came timidly, then another, louder and more insistent, as soaked and shivering families arrived one by one, their faces pale and weary. The door creaked open, and Grumpy Gordan's figure filled the frame. His expression was as overcast as the sky, his brows knit into a permanent frown. He looked over the sodden group on his doorstep, water dripping onto his carefully swept porch. His face betrayed a hint of irritation, though not enough to mask the reluctant compassion stirring beneath it. As the rain lashed against his window panes, he finally stepped aside, letting the villagers inside. The small group of neighbours huddled together in the warmth of his living room, their wet clothes leaving dark patches on his rug. Despite his muttered complaints about muddy footprints and dripping coats, Grumpy Gordan fetched an armful of blankets from his cupboard and tossed them onto the group. He turned to the fireplace, stoking the embers into a crackling blaze that sent golden light flickering across the room. The storm outside raged, but inside, the gentle crackle of the fire softened the air. As the hours passed, the villagers began to settle in, their spirits lifted by the simple warmth of the room. Laughter bubbled up as they shared stories of past festivals, childhood adventures, and humorous mishaps. The rich sound of camaraderie filled the space, bouncing off Grumpy Gordan's walls. At first he busied himself elsewhere, but soon Grumpy Gordan found himself lingering near the edge of the room, listening as villagers shared their childhood memories and heartwarming tales. The villagers, noticing his attention, invited him to share a story of his own. At first he scoffed, brushing them off, but after a bit of coaxing he found himself talking about his younger days, recounting tales of mischievous adventures and old friends. Hours passed, and the storm continued to rage outside. The villagers laughed and chatted, passing around cups of soup that Grumpy Gordan had grudgingly prepared. He watched them with a growing sense of warmth, realizing that he hadn't shared a night like this in years. As they talked and laughed, he felt a connection he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging, despite his grumbling nature. By the time the storm finally passed, the villagers had dozed off, snuggled under his blankets and resting by the fire. Grumpy Gordan watched them sleep, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He leaned back in his armchair, closing his eyes and feeling a deep contentment settle over him. For once he didn't feel the need to complain. He was glad to be surrounded by the warmth of his neighbours. When morning came, the villagers thanked him profusely, gathering their things and heading home. Grumpy Gordan, flustered by their gratitude, waved them off with a huff. As he began to tidy up, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, a rare expression that seemed out of place on his normally grumpy face. The warmth of the previous night lingered, a quiet reminder of what it felt like to be surrounded by laughter, stories, and shared memories. Perhaps Grumpy Gordan would never admit it, but he found himself wondering if someday they might all return, not just to escape a storm, but to share another evening by the fire.